Dr. Shane T. Spiker. Drum roll, please.
I can't do a drum roll. I could barely roll my R's when I was learning Spanish. So, all right. How's everybody doing? Can everybody hear me okay? I think we're good, right? Awesome. Okay, so welcome to this virtual workshop. We're really excited about this. You're going to walk away with some really cool stuff today. Now, the first part of this is going to be kind of like a primer for what we're going to talk about for this workshop and kind of what we're going to lead into, which is building out some skills for self-care. Now, I'm going to go over kind of like an overview and history of self-care and what that looks like and actually turn it into something behavioral and not talk about it being like kind of soft and fluffy, even though there's still some importance there. But it's going to be Ryan and I. We're going to have fun, and you all are going to walk away with some homework as well, which is going to be kind of the more important thing. So self-care, putting the buzzword into action. I hate that it is a really cool hashtag, I should say. Like that drives me nuts about it because I hear people talk about it, and it's just really, at the end of the day, it's not just a hashtag. Like there are some behavioral things that are important for this, and we do want to talk about that. Now, to address the elephant in the room, all of you saw my headshot where my hair was short and my beard was trimmed and I looked like I was like keeping it together. Okay. So for those of you who haven't seen me in a little bit, this is what I look like now. And my best friend replied to the ad and said, anyone who doesn't know you but sees this picture and then next see you in this with your Motorhead cover band beard will think that you're not handling this COVID thing very well. So this is my best friend that said this to me. And thought that was pretty funny. So anyway,
how you doing, Shane? Are you okay?
I'm reading a lot. I ordered like 10 books today. So I'm like, I think it's going to be okay. So anyway, I want to tell a story before we get started because I think, yeah, it's Corona hair stuff. This, to be fair, I've been planning for this pandemic for like 2 years if we're going to talk about that being a hairstyle, 2 or 3 years. So anyway, story time. I want to talk about this because the reason I started studying self-care was because I started going to conferences and I started kind of watching, I do wash my beard really well too. Now, I started going to conferences early on in my career, like before I was a behavior analyst, and like kind of like we all do, we all can't help but observe people. And the first conference I went to, I'm pretty sure the alcohol was totally gone by the first night. And I remember carrying people out of stairwells. And I remember thinking like, that's not good. Like that's not like a normal thing for people to engage in, right? And so I started thinking about that, but then I was working at this place that shall go unnamed. And my supervisor at the time really struggled with engaging in self-care. And so what would happen is something would happen, some kind of really drastic thing would happen, and she would have to shut down the entire agency. And shut down the entire agency for like 2 weeks, 3 weeks while we caught up on paperwork or did whatever, because like we would get a letter for an audit and all of a sudden it was like chaos, right? And so, which was fine, but it was still a problem because, there were some other things in play. And so I kind of started thinking about this idea of like, how do we take care of ourselves as helping professions? And I would see people burn out, and we had friends that burn out and they left the field. And so I kind of started thinking it from that perspective as like, we're helpers, right? We are in a helping profession. We're in a human services field, and we probably give more of ourselves than we can possibly give, which is an issue, right? It becomes an issue because there's something that I talk about in another class called pathological altruism. The idea that we give and we give and we give so much that we give to a detriment, like to ourselves, right? The idea that we give so much that we have nothing left to give. And I really want to avoid that in the field if we can, because it doesn't make for something that's sustainable. Okay, so it started with conferences. It started with this with my one of my first places of employment, and here we are talking about self-care. So it's not a new concept though. So when we start talking about self-care, we're talking about a nursing model. So if you go back to all the way to 1958, when you start talking about people working in self-care, you're talking about nurses, you're talking about a medical model, you're talking about Dorothea Orem, okay? And, besides that, psychologists have published a ton of articles on this. So there's plenty you can find in the social sciences realm that we should probably account for. Now, in 2011, Godfrey et al. Did this really cool meta-analysis where they identified all the articles that they could find on self-care that met this criteria, and they found 139 separate definitions of self-care within the literature. So there's really nothing there as far as like self-care that's like consistent. And so I don't know why behavior analysts are missing this. I really haven't figured out that point. But the 2 articles that I could find that talked about self-care and behavior analysis when I did my dissertation was one by Tim Vollmer and a few people in Java, and it was about toothbrushing, and that was in 1992. So that was the soonest one I could find. And then there was one from Trehan that worked with dementia patients and still engaged in activities of daily living. So there was nothing about the behavior analyst, though. And that's kind of where I started looking at this and kind of really digging into this concept. Now, for the sake of context, when we start talking about this, I'm going to go ahead and look at this idea of self-care being a repertoire of behaviors that include activities of daily living, access to preferred tasks or activities, other responses that improve the overall care of the organism. So whatever that looks like, there's a lot of different responses that can fall under that. It's kind of this like umbrella term, right? And so it can include things like toothbrushing. Like, how many of you got up and brushed your teeth today?
Yo, straight up, this one is a daily struggle for me, and it sounds ridiculous saying that as a 30-year-old man.
I have to have prompts on my window or on my mirror, so it's okay.
It's on my daily checklist. And I require prompts, too.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Get better toothpaste.
I plead the fifth.
I love it. Yeah, that's it. We got to figure it out. Yeah, other basics are tough. Okay, so like some people don't sleep well, right? So some people go to bed at like 2 or 3, 4 in the morning, right? Some people don't get up and get dressed. Some people, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. And whatever that is, like, we're not judging. Like, the idea of self-care is kind of this unique thing. I mean, another one that I always use is eating a meal, right? How many of you skipped a meal today? Well, maybe sleep is a huge challenge. Skipping meals is a huge challenge. All that stuff is, and that's okay. I want to give everybody kind of like the caveat that I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. We eat all day now. We call it the quarantine 15. So when we start talking about this, though, I want to make sure to point out that I'm not trying to guilt you into making you feel like you're not taking care of yourself, because you do what you can in the situation that you have with what you want. You know, there's a lot of stuff like that you have to be mindful of. The COVID-19 pounds. Yeah, that's fair too. Yes, Selena, we covered like an hour of content already. So I'm just kidding. No, you're good. You came in at a really good time. So we include these examples of activities of daily living, right? So these engagement and activities that we love, activities that we prefer, things like exercise, whatever that looks like. There's a whole spectrum of stuff that we want to consider. Okay, so that's the context that we're going to talk about here. So some other examples I talked about: sleeping, setting boundaries. How many of you have a hard time saying no at work? Okay.
I'm my own boss. That's what's messed up.
Yeah. Boundaries. Yeah. That's a big one, right? For sure.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Right now, everybody's like, oh, hell no. I'm good now, right? Saying no. Dating might be self-care, might be self-destructive. Based on my track record, it was a problem. Eating when you need to eat. Praying as an antecedent, not a reaction, right? That could be something that you look at for self-care. Doing community work, actually taking your vacation. How many of you answer your emails while you're on vacation?
Always.
We all do. I'm not even going to pretend like I don't.
We have
a so
we have a couple of really strong souls in here.
Yeah, more power to you. Yeah. So as we start talking about this, understand I like people are like, what's a vacation? Yeah. Which is a whole different problem. That's a whole different talk. But when I start talking about this, what I'm trying to get, the point that I'm trying to make here is more so the idea of like all these things could be considered self-care. And it's not just what you see when you look up a hashtag. All these things tend to serve you as the organism and try to help improve your care. So when we talk about hashtag self-care, it's a super cool buzzword. It's a really great aesthetic on Instagram. If you go hit that hashtag, it's like some of the photos are great, but it doesn't maintain often, right? Or it's a behavior that's kind of like these discrete behaviors that occur and they don't really stay with you. And so it's often, I would describe this as kind of a distorted idea of what self-care is, or maybe like this like really superficial version of it. And it implies that self-care has to be a vacation, it has to be wine, it has to be massage, it has to be getting your nails done, it has to be all these things. And the truth is that it doesn't have to be those things. It could be reading a book that you like. It could be reading a book that's not behavior analytics, so you get out of the field a little bit. I mean, for a year I read nothing but behavior analytic books, and I was like, I got burnt on it. Like, as much as I loved it, I was like, I can't do this anymore. So I had to go back to read some Vonnegut and stuff. So I know, how dare I, right, Casey?
Blasphemy.
sacrifice myself at the altar of Skinner. So let's dig a little bit further in this, though. Okay, we talk about self-care being broad, right? And it's kind of like this categorization of aggression. We use this term aggression to describe problem behavior, but aggression can be verbal, physical, it can include weapons, minor injuries, it can include attempts, it can do all these other things. So when people talk about self-care, they go, well, what is self-care? I would do the same thing. Well, what is aggression? Okay, and we start really getting into it and starting to define behavior. So I've never thought it would happen. First year was burned on reading behavior analytic content. Didn't take long. Yeah, there you go. There you go, Kathy. You got it. So now, this brings me to the conversation about domains of self-care. Okay, so when we talk about this idea of self-care, there are so many different areas that you can engage in self-care, and they all overlap in some way. So you've got physical, social, occupational and educational, emotional, psychological, spiritual, and that's not, I wouldn't say that is an exhaustive list. There's plenty of stuff that we can talk about within that that's going to be really critical to understand as far as self-care goes. Now, each of these domains, as you dig into them, there's going to be specific behaviors related to that quality of the domain or that specific entity, right? Like whatever that looks like. So as such, each domain can include its own contingencies. It includes its own MOs. It includes its own values. It includes its own set of anything that goes along with it, just like every other behavior. What you might do is you might reply or you respond to a specific domain in a certain way. Like maybe when you talk about relationships, there's certain parts of relationships that are really valuable to you. When you talk about occupational or educational, some people like to want to pursue their PhDs. Some people don't. And that's something that you have to look at as far as individualized self-care. Now, responses in one domain may not be functional in another domain. So, and I think that's important too when we start talking about self-care. It's like, if I want to go and I want to go get my PhD, for those of you who are in PhD programs, or I mean, most of you have probably completed grad school at least, when you start thinking about that idea, we know that we sacrifice things like our relationships when we're in grad school. We know we sacrifice things like our psychological well-being in some of our programs, which is an issue with academia, but it's still something that does happen, right? So when you start thinking about these domains of self-care and kind of how they overlap and how they interact, we have to be mindful that like one of these domains might start getting in the way of the other. And we have to start figuring out where the balance is so that we can still maintain all that. Like it's kind of like a waterbed. I know it's kind of a weird old school reference, but like when you push on one end of the waterbed or you lay on one side of the waterbed, the water goes somewhere else, right? So that's kind of how that goes with self-care. It's kind of this ebb and flow. And Christine says the dissertation process was awful. Yes, it was. Yeah, displacement. There you go. That's the word I was looking for. So self-care. These domains, they kind of exist. They ebb and flow, and it's important to recognize what falls where when you go through this. Now, when I talked about physical, focuses on physical well-being, right? That's like your fitness, going out and getting sunshine, eating food. Mental could be like psychological well-being. Emotional might be consistent and appropriate affect, right? If you have somebody who's kind of like up and down all over the place, like that might be something to look at. Social might be your references to social engagement in preferred workplace activities. So how many of you are working on passion projects at work or get a chance to work on passion projects at work?
That was always one of my like number one things I look for in an employer.
Yeah. I mean, and if you're not, you're probably finding that somewhere else, right? Yeah. Like, I mean, I would imagine like most of us probably have a job and then the other place we go like, hey, we're going to go work somewhere else. We're going to contact this. Yeah. Somewhat. Yes. Yeah. I mean, sometimes you
on
got
top of the job. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly it. That to me is like, you're contacting some self-care that's related to occupational well-being or educational well-being, right? And spiritual being some kind of connection with religious. Oh yeah, I teach at Arizona State too. It's fun. I like it. I love it. So it's good stuff. So the spiritual part of this too is like connecting with religious or spiritual activities, like whatever that looks like for you. It's not going to be the same for everybody, but it's going to be individualized. And that still goes into these ideas of domains. Now, we start looking at this, the impact of self-care and self-care deficits, okay? So now we kind of understand what self-care is. We're kind of build that up, and we're going to talk more about what that looks like in a little bit and different factors. But one thing that happens is if we're not taking good care of ourselves, we have this thing called compassion fatigue. So as far as compassion fatigue goes or caregiver burnout or diminished outcomes, there's a lot of different things that could happen. For example, has anybody ever been just like so tired of work that when you get that phone call from a parent, you're just kind of like, I'm good. I don't need to answer it. I'm just going to go ahead and red button this and go to the next day. Like we all have that. Okay. And that's okay because we're human beings. Like, you shouldn't feel guilty for that. Okay. I see a lot of people raising their hands, and I'm totally into that. It makes me sad. And we should, the thing is like, it's not that we should feel guilty about that. It's that we should probably understand what's happening that's contributing to that feeling, right? There's something else going on that's making it so that we're not really valuing whatever that is. And it's not that we don't value that person or respect that person. It's just there's something missing there. There's other contingencies at play. And so now compassion fatigue is kind of nebulous. Caregiver burnout's kind of nebulous. Like, that's all fairly, like, that's a little bit fluffy. So in behavior analysis, though, there are observable and measurable events that can occur that are a result of these things, like canceled sessions, hasty treatment decisions, slower reaction times, higher risk of error, lower tolerance of requests. We've all probably experienced these things in one form or another, right? And there's probably several other behavioral outcomes that come as a result of self-care deficits. And we have to kind of keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, what you want to start doing is you want to start assessing self-care. And this is where we're going to start kind of really workshopping stuff today, is starting to think about where we're going from here to build your self-care routines. And the first thing to look at is this idea of basic conditional factors, okay? With basic conditional factors, or BCFs, it's kind of like your privilege, okay? And there are these variables that are at play that in the experimental design world, they can be threats to internal validity. They're things that get in the way of our experiments and stuff, but they're factors that aren't behavioral, but do influence our well-being and actually influence our decisions to engage in certain levels of self-care, right? So maybe we can't contact some self-care activities or behaviors, or we can't do certain things because there's other things at play that get in the way that are more pressing or prioritized. So when we talk about basic conditional factors, age is one. I know that sounds kind of silly, but I'm 34. I'm getting older, right? My knees are going, my back hurts, like, my hair is turning gray.
You got some tinsel in that beard.
Some tinsel, yeah. You see all that? So 34. I mean, it's fine. It's a good thing. But when you start aging, like, there are certain factors that you have to consider that have to do with your health and well-being, right? And that's something to note. It's not necessarily something that's going to diminish or destroy your self-care routines, but it's something to note as maybe an influence for your self-care. Gender, right? You might have specific gender needs. Like, I know my friends one of my good friends is transgender and has to go through hormone treatment, and that is a very specific type of conditional factor that does influence levels of self-care. Developmental state. Okay, so like how well developed are you? Where are you at, like, as far as your skills go and education and stuff like that? Health status, sociocultural variables, right? Healthcare system. Right now, our healthcare system is incredibly strained. So that does contribute to lack of self-care for some people, where maybe I'm going to get a basic checkup. I might not do that right now, right? Because the entire system that we are living in the United States, at least, is incredibly strained. So that's something to consider as far as a variable to look at. Family system. Do you have supports? I was lucky enough to grow up in a town where my family is here. Not everybody has that, especially like maybe parents that are raising their kids. They don't have that access to a family system. Pattern of living. Like, maybe I work 40, 50, 60 hours a week and then I go party all weekend. Like, that's going to contribute to my self-care too. Environmental factors too. Where are you living? For me in the state of Florida, it's always hot and that kind of sucks. But there's no snow here, and I will forever appreciate that. So
missing out on life, man.
No, I'm not.
That's super relevant. That's literally why I left Florida. Like, I did not like the climate. Yeah, complete opposite.
It plays a role. I mean, I've lived here. I love living by the beach. I like having the beach. I never go to the beach, but I like having the beach. Literally, if I point that direction, that's the beach. Okay, so I love having that there. That's part of my environmental factors that do influence my behavior. And then resources. Can you access certain resources? Do you have certain resources available to you for whatever need? And now, as we start looking at this and we kind of framing all this, like, these are just different things, right? These are just different elements that contribute to your self-care that might have more need than others, right? So maybe my health status is that I have a medical condition that requires a lot more medical oversight. Maybe my sociocultural variables mean that there are certain parts of my culture that influence my behavior. Maybe there's certain traditions, like spiritual traditions. There's all kinds of stuff that influences your self-care. And all of these things, while they're not static, they still get in the way of just your general routines. There's a lot of contingencies related to these things. So when I talked about lifestyle variables, I mentioned kind of like the idea of like going and working all week and going and partying. But these are easier to change since you can't change age or anything like that. How many hours per week do you work? How many hours per week do you engage in academic activities? I mean, Ryan will probably talk about this later, where he is like a king of scheduling stuff. Like, you got to be able to schedule stuff like this into your routines, because there's just only so much time in the day to do certain things, right? So
100%.
there's 100%, right? So that's kind of what this looks like. So examples of like sleep, exercise. Like there was a period of time where I was so busy that I scheduled sleep. I was like, I'm going to sleep at this time. That's it. That's like, I made an appointment for my bed.
I still schedule my sleep.
There you go. So some people do that, and that works. I don't have to do that anymore, but I used to do that. Okay. So as you start to assess your self-care needs, you want to start looking at this, like, what's your current status and not what can I change? This is what lifestyle variables look like. What's my current status? What's going on right now in the moment, right? I did this with an RBT that I was working with, and I was like, okay, so you're going to school full-time, you're working full-time, you have, you're the primary caregiver for your grandmother who's ailing, you're doing this, that, and it ended up being like 144 hours per week that they were doing stuff. And it was like, there's not that many hours in a week.
There's 168, but
yeah. 168, yeah. So I was like, yeah.
That's completely over what you should be allocating, yeah.
Yeah. I was like, and that didn't include sleep. I was like, when do you sleep? So it was a whole thing. So I had to kind of like help her reframe that. And that was starting with those lifestyle variables. Now, you might be considering, when you're starting to look at self-care, you might be addressing one thing and not another, okay? And so that maybe you're addressing lifestyle variables, maybe you're addressing BCFs, whatever that looks like. But you have to kind of figure out where to start, right? And so deficits in one area can actually cause stressors in another, okay? So if you're having a problem at home, that might impact your work. You might not be able to compartmentalize it. So not everybody can. I think behavior analysts do a pretty good job of that, but I still think it's a little bit challenging. My point being here that these domains that we're talking about are not mutually exclusive. They are not separate from one another, and they do influence that. And Sarah made a great point. Being full-time plus being a mom, that's just those two things. Like being a behavior analyst and a parent, that's enough. Or just being a behavior analyst and trying to have a social life, that's enough. Like all those things influence everything, right? So it's important to kind of keep that in mind.
I think I was told you get your social life, your grades, or sleep. In grad school, you get to pick two.
Yeah.
you don't get to pick three. I think that holds for parents as well. Part of the reason I hit up Shane is obviously he knows a lot of this, but also I don't have the perspective of a parent whatsoever. I feel like I can take a perspective a little bit, but I also know that having no children means I can't take that perspective. So I'm glad that he was able to hop on and relate with you all on that. But seriously, my hat's off to y'all.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? It's and that's the thing is like there are so many things that influence one another that one person's self-care problem is not another's. And I kind of always use the same thing when I talk about crisis cases that I work with is my crisis is not your crisis. Like my fire is not your fire and it's not their fire. Everybody's fire is different. So it's important to kind of take that context into play when you're starting to look at self-care in general. So I like to take a functional approach. Not every response benefits the organism and the environment, but some things work better than others, okay? And so as we start looking at this, selection is going to occur based on those environmental stimuli, all those contingencies, and Ryan's going to talk about contingencies in a little bit, about this a little bit more. But, your behavior at work is definitely going to be different than your behavior at home. And, mine is actually a little more restrained at home than it is at work, which is a whole different thing. But when you start thinking about this, your behavior is going to change based on your environmental stimuli. And even your self-caring behavior, it serves a function, right? It does contact some kind of contingency. It does contact some reinforcers that we have to be mindful of. So what's the function? You're at work, you may answer emails and count on the number because it feels good and it reduces stress, right? Anybody do that? Here's something I don't understand. Why do people not read their emails or delete emails they don't need? I don't understand people that have like 10,000 unread emails in their Gmail. It stresses me out.
Overwhelms me too, man.
It's unbelievable. How do you live like that? Like that is the worst. So
that's me. They're not human.
They're not human. Yeah. Whatever that is. I mean, like guilty. I said, I'm guilty. Nice. Sorry, Liberty. I'm not trying to stress you out. So avoidance state. There you go. There's a contingency right there.
I have 10K you're a hoarder. Emails.
I saw somebody who had so many emails, it maxed out the number. Like it was like they had so many, it just went back to zero. So those red bubbles are awful. So another thing, a functional approach to self-care, right? You have strep throat, so you go to a doctor for treatment because you want to feel better. Yeah, I like the hoarding one. That one made me laugh. At a conference, you purchase a drink and perhaps have a few too many, right? Because you're away from all your responsibilities. You don't have to worry too much. Or you currently have 2 weeks of vacation accrued at work, but don't want to take any time off because of your work duties. I hear that one in behavior analysis more than anything else. I have time to take vacation, and I don't take vacation because I have more work to engage in when I get back. Okay, I hear that more often than not. So all of our behavior has a function. Self-care has a function too, okay? Now, part of the problem with self-care too is this idea, this falsehood of short-term benefit, okay? And basically what it is relief is awesome, momentary relief is really cool, and a glass of wine probably does feel good, but it doesn't actually tend to the problem, right? So why is that EO for wine so valuable? Like, why is that so high? Like, why is wine so valuable? Why is that vacation so valuable? So when we start doing these like small behaviors, these discrete behaviors to like as self-care, as like treating ailments, wine tastes good, totally fine, but it doesn't tend to the problem for why I need it in the first place, right? Because some people will do that. And so the second thing is, the first is we don't attend to the problem. The second thing is we haven't changed our behavior to address the problem. And finally, it's likely the problem will get worse and our experiential avoidance will persist. So we have to start looking at this and avoid this idea of like these short-term benefits, right? These short-term reliefs that we get. And these one-shot, these discrete behaviors, they don't persist and they don't develop into caring habits. And that's what we want to really focus on as people walk away with this idea of a caring habit. Now, the problem with long-term benefit is that we've got delay discounting, right? So that relief is going to come a long way away, right? So reinforcers lose their value the longer it takes to get there. We don't see the payout, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to exercise every day. I'm going to brush my teeth. I'm going to avoid the dentist. I'm going to do all those things. But I don't see really a benefit except for I'm avoiding getting sick or I'm avoiding getting cavities, right? So when we don't see the payout, that's a different problem. So short-term, I get a glass of wine, I get a massage, I feel good. Long term, don't address the problem, don't see the payout from the problem. And so self-care doesn't always have that immediate gain that we look for, but the behavior is still necessary. And we have to look at how to program so that those little benefits kind of come along the way. So as we start assessing the problem, we need to understand what the problem is and why we need self-care. So burnout, we talked about burnout briefly, okay? Burnout is a mentalism, so is anxiety, as we start conceptualizing this. But behavior related to burnout is a problem. And so we need to assess what behaviors are becoming a problem. So what behaviors for you are becoming a problem? This is what you want to start looking at specifically. So identify a behavior that you find that's related to burnout. And why is this a behavior problem? So let's go ahead and do that real quick in the chat. So what's that behavior that you engage in that's related to burnout and why is it a problem? I was recording my drinks on a standard acceleration chart.
I was. Who said that?
Ada?
Ada? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I've tracked mine a number of times. I've got a really cool chart. I think I haven't shared it publicly. I don't know. I'm not gonna commit yet. I think I might though. I've got a really cool one that was just like me struggling through some like personal stuff. It was not bad, but it was just me tracking drinks and other things like that over like a 3-month summertime.
Yeah,
it was killer.
I'm sure it was interesting. So Selena, the question is, what's a behavior that you engage in that's related to burnout, and start looking at that, because I want to start kind of addressing that real quick. Burnout for avoiding. I see that. I see privately cussing people out. Tuesday, I do that out loud. Just get comfortable with just saying out loud. You'll be fine.
Crying.
Time spent on Facebook, not stop working, staying up too late, avoid cleaning. Yeah, so you all start to, alcohol consumption definitely increases. Yeah, stressing about children's futures, procrastinating about your FIT videos. Anna, you got to watch those videos.
Overworking.
Don't procrastinate. Non-stop working. So here's my thing. The thing that I'm going to point out here is, like, obviously you're here to learn something about self-care, but it's already in strengthening your repertoire that you're pointing out that you've got these behaviors that are related to self-care. So you're already assessing it. You're already pointing out, like, you're already great observers of your own behavior, and you're like, oh shit, like, this is what I do when things are going rough, right? So you're already doing that. And you kind of, some people talked about how they usually address the behavior, right? They're avoiding, they're overthinking, they're doing all this stuff. And we see that this behavior does continue a little bit, right? We continue to engage in this level of avoidance or this level of burnout behavior because we're still not addressing whatever it is that's giving us burnout, that's stressing us out. We're not tackling that thing, right? I saw something the other day that said, like, instead of pulling people out of the river, why don't we go down the river a little bit and find out what people are falling in to begin with, right? That was like a really cool like analogy or metaphor for me, and it made sense. It's like, so now we know I'm watching my FIT videos, I'm catching up, I'm snacking. You know, I love that idea of like, now we know this behavior is a problem, but we're not going up the river to stop it from happening, okay? So, as Israel Goldiamond says, it's contingencies, plural. Okay, and this is what we're going to get into today. We're really going to dig into this a little bit. So there are a lot of competing contingencies. Okay, and we've all said something like this. We've all done this. Okay, I've got to answer this email real quick. Has anybody ever done that? Always. I've got to answer this email real quick. Always, just real quick. If we don't help them, who will? When we're taking on another case, right? Like a case that we don't have room on our caseload for. Okay. This will just be a quick call. I'm out to dinner with the family. This will just be a quick call. It's fine. We've all said this, right? Because there are multiple contingencies at play, okay? And all of us do it, right? So as you start thinking about this, you start thinking about those burnout behaviors. What are those contingencies to the behavior itself? There's all those things that you're doing. What are those contingencies? What happened when you engage in it? What happened when you don't? All that stuff. Like as you start kind of digging into this, you see there's so much stuff that goes into this behavior. But like specifically to those behaviors of answering the email and answering the phone calls and doing all that stuff, there's contingencies related to that too, right? So if I don't answer it right now, I'm going to have to address it later. Okay. This family's going to keep bugging me. Right. Or, you know, because the thing is, like, at the end of the day, the email is going to be there tomorrow. The text is going to be there tomorrow. You can call that family tomorrow too, most of the time. Right. So it's important to kind of like learn how to do that. That's where your boundary setting and your self-care is going to come in. Now, one thing I want to try to impart on everybody on this is this idea that self-caring isn't selfish. Okay. It's an adaptive skill. And so we should treat it like an adaptive skill. We're going to treat it like a skill acquisition program that we're going to work on it ourselves, and we're going to reinforce our own behavior. We're going to find a way that it contacts naturally occurring reinforcers, but it's an adaptive skill. And that's how we should look at it. It's not selfish. Okay. When you engage in behavior related to burnout, it's disruptive, it's problematic, it reduces your quality of life. And all of us have mentioned a few different ways that our behavior reduces our quality of life as a result. Okay. So when we talk about these self-care behaviors, the ones that we want to look at are things like returning or maintaining homeostasis, right? What's going to get me to baseline? I make the joke all the time that like I need a cup of coffee to get me to baseline. Like I'm nowhere near where I need to be until I get that cup of coffee in my throat.
Same.
Like, and it's got to be a big cup of coffee. Like I would drink something like this in the morning, you know? So, but that cup of coffee that's what gets me to baseline. That gets me to homeostasis, okay? And if I'm still not there, then a second cup of coffee usually gets me there. So I need a tropical vacation to return to baseline. Hey, Liberty, that's what I'm saying. Orange Crush. Yeah. Oh, man. Now I'm like, now I want to go get a soda, but I can't go get a soda because everything's closed. Oh, thanks, David. Appreciate that. So contacting specific preferred activities or social contingencies, right? So sitting down and watching a show that is maybe just kind of mindless, reading a book that you want to read, listening to music that you like, achieving career outcomes, right? Those are self-care behaviors, all help you get to those spaces, okay? And that's really what we're trying to do here with the self-care thing. Now let's analyze the scenario. So it's after hours. You've worked 10 hours total in a day, okay? You've worked a long time. Today, so, okay, I'm going to start here and say this as a caveat too. By the time this is done, I will have finished a 14-hour day, but it's okay. I've had a lot of coffee. Do as I say, not as I do.
It's because I asked you to add one more thing to your list when I called you about this.
And my issue is that I didn't set a boundary, and I said yes. But actually, I think this is important. And this is actually really reinforcing for me because I do like talking about this. So between treatment, between reassessments, data analysis, you worked a 10-hour day, okay? It's 7 p.m., and right as you're about to sit down for dinner, a parent calls and tells you that it's important that they speak with you immediately, okay? There's a lot of stuff going on there. So let's analyze this. First, we know the antecedent, the phone call, okay? Yeah, Meredith, I mean, can I give you all a piece of advice about this? We're not an emergency response team. Behavior analysts are a treatment team, okay? We are consultants. We are not an emergency response team. And we get treated like emergency response teams, and we are simply not that, okay? Unless you work on a crisis team, that's a different story, okay? That's a different thing. But for the most part, behavior analysts are like, we get treated like an emergency response team, but nobody calls their doctor like this. Nobody calls their nurses like this. We're ABA, not EMS. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you. Okay, so we know the antecedent, right? The antecedent is the phone call. Okay, so what do? There's all these competing pathways. Okay, so let's start looking at this. We can take the call or we can don't take the call, right? Those are our two main options. Let's analyze those. Yes, thank you, Justin. Response team equals pathological altruism. I love that. Okay, so we can either take the call, we don't take the call. As we analyze this further, we take the call, we can avoid an issue with the parent, we can problem solve the issue, we can miss dinner with our own family, and we can work after hours. Those are some different consequences that kind of come out of that, right? Or if we don't take the call, we can have dinner with the family, we can avoid the issue with the parent entirely, we can add work for tomorrow, and there's no work after hours. Now, that's not an exhaustive list of all the different contingencies that are at play here, but whenever that phone call comes through, we have seconds to make that decision about whether to take that call or not and analyze all these contingencies. And that's a lot of where we get stuck. And that's exactly what Tarsa says is like, that's what voicemail is for, okay? And that's why sometimes a second work phone is for. Like, hey, you call this phone, okay? And that's stuff to look at. Is like as we start analyzing these contingencies related to self-care and maybe where like boundaries are breaking down, this is a way to look at it. So one thing I look at, there's always the what ifs, right? And we're going to change the what ifs into something useful. I hear this a lot. The what if they call me back? What if there's a problem? What if I don't answer this email? What if da 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 da? So let's turn that into something useful. We're good practitioners and we're good predictors of behavior, okay? We can't predict everything. We're not good observers of our own behavior always, okay? We have those moments. But if we start going through every what if as a hypothetical scenario, we're going to start doing that and we're going to lose our minds. So we have to kind of get out of that what if, right? Think about this for a second. When you took the board exam, one of the biggest pieces of advice that I give my students is that do not start what-ifing the hell out of that question, right? When you start what-ifing that question, you're adding information that's not even there. And then you're going to start getting yourself stuck, right? So keep that in mind as you start going through this. It's like, don't start what-ifing the situation. So if you can kind of take that hypothetical, every what-if is a hypothetical. So the question turns into this. Are we connected to what's valuable? And that's something that we have to start looking at. It's like, is what we're doing valuable? Is what we are doing and what we're working towards, is our self-care something that we find valuable? So we have to start doing what matters, okay? So when we reference value, we're talking about things that are important to us. We value work, we value our clients, but we tend to undervalue our own time. We undervalue our own schedules. We tend to value other people's time over our own, okay? How many times have you showed up at an appointment and the family didn't show up? They no call, no show, and we still go back and talk to that family and we still work with them. Happened today. Thank you, Sarah. It happens all the time. Students, people who are working towards certification, how many times have you had a student not show up or show up late to a meeting, right? We tend to, for some reason, we tend to value somebody else's time over our own more often than not. And I'm not saying that we should be selfish with our time, but what I'm saying is like, every hour that I'm working, every hour that I'm doing something with a family, every phone call that I take is taking away from my own time. It's taking away from my own self-care. It's taking away from my own health. It's taking away from my well-being, from the time with my kids. Like whatever you want to look at, it's taking away some time from something else that you might be doing. And I'm not saying it from the perspective of like, my time is my time. But I'm saying it more from the perspective of like, we don't value ourselves enough to even start drawing the boundaries. Like that initial boundary of, I don't work past 8 o'clock. I don't answer the phone past 8 o'clock. That's a perfectly acceptable boundary for a behavior analyst that works 3 hours a week with a family. That's perfectly okay. So I'm giving you all permission to set boundaries, okay? So you're welcome. I know it sounds
Thank you, Shane.
But I think that's the thing is like we have to start valuing our time. Now, I'm not going to dig into cultural selection too much, but we have to look at this too. The behavior analytic community does have this work hard, play hard type of feel to it, but we rarely get to play. Like, let's be real. Like, you go to a conference, people compare their battle scars, right? We all have war stories. We've all seen it. We've probably all engaged in it without even thinking about it. That's kind of the culture of what we're looking at, right? So we share war stories, but conferences themselves are exhausting too, right? So does anybody come home from a conference and need a vacation from the conference?
I have never been so rested because I have not gone to conferences for the last like 4 weeks or 6 weeks. It is unreal.
Seriously, I feel really good because I was supposed to in March. I was at a conference every weekend. That's what it was scheduled, and I was like, I'm so glad. I'm actually like was really relieved. Yeah, thank you, David. That's what I'm saying. I want to go barbecue. Right now it's webinar exhaustion. Yeah, thanks to Central Reach, like everybody's tired because like they're just contacting all the CEUs on the planet, you know. So, but when we start thinking about this, like conferences themselves, that is a work thing, right? That is really a professional thing. I love conferences. I love going to conferences. I love seeing everybody that I don't get to see, especially Steve Foreman, right? I love seeing Steve, like, and I love going to conferences. It's so much fun. But it is legitimately exhausting. And I'm tired for like days on end after I get back. And another thing too is we tend to be 24-hour response teams because that's kind of the culture of it, right? And that's what we start looking at. It's like we have to understand that our behavior, not only do we have our individual context, but the culture in which we work does share that context. So what do we do with that? We can cite the culture. We can talk about the immediate contingencies. We can talk about value, skill acquisition, varied responses, constellation of variables. We can talk about all that bullshit. But the truth is that we have to understand that self-care is a set of behaviors. It's an adaptive skill that's supposed to help you get better and be okay so that you can do the best job that you can for the people that you care about, which are your clients, but also the people in your lives, okay? So your homework, which we're going to dig into in a little bit, okay, because then Ryan's got a little piece that he's going to do. But as we start looking at this, we want to address problem behavior that's occurring, and that's your problem behavior, not the problem behavior of the families, not the problem behavior of your work, your problem behavior because you're missing some skill. You're not engaging in self-care the way you need to. We're going to isolate those contingencies. We're going to identify those environmental changes that we can make, and we're going to determine the replacement skills that we can engage in that we're going to start working on and workshopping tonight. Okay? So, that being said, that's all I've got as far as a primer. I know I just got on my soapbox and yelled at y'all for a little bit.
Words.
Listen. Demand. So anyway, Brian, you want to take over? You got your stuff?
Yeah, let's see if there's any questions. Please speak now or forever hold your peace. I'm joking. There's a Q&A section. You can use it anytime. No one's asked, but know that it is open. Bam. So what I have for you is a couple different slides looking at similar perspective. Mine's going to be much shorter than his, and we're going to jump into Miro, how it works, and we'll see how this goes because this is the first time, not the first time I've used Miro, second time. It's the first time I've used it in like a longer format like we're going to be doing over these next few hours.
Yeah.
So, okay, we've got roughly an hour and 15 minutes left. Here we go. Where am I at? All right. Confirm real quick. Can you all see that well? Our beautiful smiling faces?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Shane. All right. Can you watch the comments for me?
I will.
All right. Sweet. Because I got to go full screen for some animations on this one. All right. So Shane talked about this a little bit, the nonlinear behavioral approach from Israel Goldiamond. It is a fantastic gem that's not really known. I love to talk about it. I found it because of a big shout out to Joe Lang. If anyone knows TB, Joe Lang is it's Terrence V. Joe Lang. He's got 4 names for a name. He's a fantastic gentleman. He studied with Izzy Goldiamond. Goldiamond came out of the University of Chicago, or he was housed at the University of Chicago. And the biggest takeaway, which you've already seen, we've talked about, from his way of thinking was the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. We've heard this in philosophy. We've heard this in different areas. And he really espoused this and put this together in a product called the Blue Books. And they were just called Blue Books because they're printed on blue paper on the covers. And it was things that he handed out to his close graduate students. They were not like mass published. They weren't even finished, actually. You'll see in the table of contents, there was a bunch of stuff that was planned that wasn't written. Amazing man, I think, on his way of thinking. Just personal anecdote that I've heard from others. Thinking of him as he was actually wheelchair bound. He suffered, I believe, a car crash in the 60s. And he was actually known of being very snappy, snarky, and didn't play well all the time with other behavior analysts at conferences and such. So partially probably a reason why his stuff wasn't out there as much, but brilliant gentleman. Wish I could have met him. Fantastic dude. You can get the Blue Books. I will be sharing a link on where to check those out. Now, his thinking between linear and nonlinear. What are the differences here? Well, linear is falling in a straight line. There's two variables that have a linear relation when each change in one produces a fixed change in the other. We're going to talk about this. It is very consistent with a way of philosophy called mechanism. The idea here is that there's kind of an infinite number of variables out there, but we can discover them as a science, figure them out, categorize them, and then it's kind of like this puzzle. We just have to figure out what the pieces are. So you can do this with the basic ABC analysis or in a four-term contingency in our field. What you do is you're kind of going out there and you're looking for the variables, plugging them in, validating whether or not they work, and you move forward. That can be a mechanistic way to approach things. However, you can approach the same field in multiple different viewpoints. I'll get to that. For nonlinear, what's going on here is multiple intersecting contingencies. This is the beauty of his way of thinking and approaching things. And this is more in line with what I would say is contextualism. Really at its core, behavior analysis and how Skinner originally outlined radical behaviorism fit in this contextualism. But if anyone's wanting to know kind of where these branches moved, inside behavior analysis or professional behavior analysis, there's a lot of mechanistic thinking, although people won't agree with that all the time. There's a lot of contextualistic thinking. Part of the reason that you see the Association of Contextual Behavior Science pop up in 2001, 2002, and the formation of that was they really pushed heavily on kind of this adapted new form of contextualism called functional contextualism. So things like ACT and RFT have this different flavor, really, because they have a foundation, a philosophical foundation that's outlined a little bit differently than what we're used to in our graduate teaching programs, radical behaviorism and such. So the gist there is you might see nonlinear, you won't see nonlinear talked about quite a bit. It fits within contextualism. It should fit within our science. You'll see Skinner talked about as nonlinear in some ways, but you won't see that all the time. And part of the reason is the way in which their models were kind of set up. That is my point, not like an empirical demonstration. This is my personal take on why that happens. So the Skinnerian model, kind of from a mechanistic perspective, you have an antecedent, you have a behavior, and you have a consequence. Your goal here is to really figure out these. They added the motivation operation later on, and this is your four-term contingency. The idea here is that you figure these out and you can start to analyze your own behavior or someone else's, make changes, and move forward in the basic conceptual model. Now, if we kind of adapted this, there was a number of people that changed this from antecedent to response. There's a reason it's not behavior and it's response. To postcedent, which is kind of weird, but it wasn't called a consequence because it could function differently. And then motivation operation stuck around, and then the whole thing was called behavior. And the reason being, I know a lot of us know this, so just kind of a recap, is that these variables, the four circles, matter, but really it's the relations between them and how they affect each other. And I wanted to highlight that. First, really quickly, Goldiamond, this is not a quiz, you won't be quizzed on this obviously. This is a bit of a different crazy model, but I can explain it quite quickly. So he had the SD, the discriminative stimulus. We all know that, SDS delta. He called the behavior of response, single instance behavior response. He had consequences. This plus minus, I'm not going to get into it tonight, but there's actually a lot more that goes into there. But think about it as basic. Think about it as your basic positive, negative reinforcement, punishment, etc. Now, he determined that it was useful to have SDA and SDI. This abstractional and instructional control is how they handled rule-governed behavior. So they actually had a dedicated term for it. Abstractional means it's something that you kind of learn as a result of a lot of contingencies. You start to develop that rule as a result of going through a lot of contingency learning. Instructional is someone tells you the rule. So it's kind of like you derive the rule versus you learned a rule and you followed the rule. Abstractional versus instructional. And that, just like the SDs, could also impact behavior. Potentiating variables, he just used a different term for reasons he talks about for MOs, and that is the potentiating variable. So things are potentiated. And his argument here is that all of these variables you've seen so far could be potentiated in different ways. And lastly, stimulus props, which we talk about all the time as context. Now, the context for stimulus props and kind of the connection there is stimulus props are things that are in the environment that don't influence your behavior. So this whole time that I've been talking to you, the books behind me, the lights, my microphone, my water bottle, none of this, these are all stimulus props. They weren't influencing my behavior. The chat was and the stimuli on the screen were, but those things weren't. As soon as I brought them up and I started talking about them though, bam, those things are now a part of my environment. They would no longer be a stimulus prop. So it was a way to talk about things that are in the environment that are not affecting behavior that may affect it. So he had a different way to look at this sort of thing. Now, the basic behavioral question is what he said we were trying to really get at, which are what are the behaviors being observed and the conditions under which they occur. What has to occur in order for the observer to state that it has occurred? A big distinction here, right? What are we trying to observe? What are the conditions? But also, what does it take for the observer to state it? And I feel like that's a big part of self-care, is we're trying to figure out our verbal behavior also to figure out these conditions. It's not just the conditions and analyzing it per se. It's looking at, can we raise our awareness around that? Now, the two outcomes of this basic behavioral question, if you can start to figure that out, is identify the variables, that is either behaviors and contingencies, controlling a tact of an ambiguous event. So can you state what it is, pinpoint it, and then provides questions for research regarding the behavior, sets a criterion, which I think is kind of cool because you can start to really self-chart and explore different areas at an individual level, or it sets the stage for our science and what we should start asking. So this is getting close to my wrap up on what it is. So what's nonlinear mean again? There are always multiple intersecting contingencies of behavior. That is the clapping emoji as I'm saying it. Is that important? Always multiple intersecting contingencies. And a reinforcement of one behavior will produce a change in other behaviors within this response class. We've got an example, then we're going to get back to that last point. So you have your basic ABC analysis here, some conveniently kind of off to the side. Now, the thing is that same antecedent might actually trigger other behavior that leads to the same consequence. Multiple behaviors in the same response class can lead to the same consequence. We know this, right? Now, the same behavior can actually produce multiple consequences, multiple stimulus events that can be influencing behavior. Now, the idea here is that you have concurrently other antecedents and behavior consequence conditions that are continuing to go on. So other A's lead to B's, lead to C's, and this seems overwhelming, but this is really, I think, the beauty of behavior analysis and also the hard part of behavior analysis, that there's stuff going on all the time. So right now, as I'm talking about this, you all are paying attention to this, presumably my words, but also there's other things going on in your environment. And so to bring it back to this last bullet point, the reinforcement of one behavior will produce a change in other behaviors within that response class. This is really what we see. You can work on one area of self-development, but then you watch others unravel sometimes, or other issues pop up. And it's kind of figuring out the between response classes. And that's where I like his line of thinking. So where has this been applied? Just so you know that I'm not completely full of crap. Problem behavior, aggression, disruption, self-injury, they applied it there. Lots of research in those areas. Learning, sequence of instruction, the entire reading and reading comprehension program of HeadSprout, which has taught over 3 million children how to read without ever hearing or seeing them, which sounds crazy when you think about it. It's because they built this line of thinking into a computer-based instruction, and they had over 92% success rate with children just sitting down and going through it. It's because they spent the time analyzing every possible contingency and building it. Now that's crazy, not expecting us all to do that. And it requires a lot of funding to be able to dedicate years to be able to do something like that. But it's led to, I would say, one of the coolest applications of our field and a scalable solution of HeadSprout. Psychotic behavior, they did a lot in psychiatry and traditional mental health areas. Emotions, he did a lot of work in. Stuttering habits. He actually developed a program. There's a research study in JABA or one of our other landmark journals like that. Can't recall exactly. But what he did is he published a research story. So it's 34 participants, and essentially 33 out of 34 were successful in eliminating their stuttering. All the social significance, and validity was there. People enjoyed it. One of the issues, though, was that one person that didn't experience it, like successful outcomes. And he was saying that in a lab meeting that they had discussed how they had discussed that case, and what it was a procedural error. The graduate intern at the time was in conducting the task analysis and the steps wrong, essentially. They corrected that, and 34 out of 34 were successful. And it's fantastic. If you want to know the kind of TLDR, the too long didn't read, it had to do with the intervention was slowing down so that you can reinforce our correct articulation at a certain word per minute, and then you'd speed them back up. It required some intensity to be able to do that on the person's life, but it was successful overwhelmingly. Marital troubles, they also worked in the areas of self-management, which is why I'm bringing this up in this context. So, real quick, are there any questions off that? I'm going to pop out of this really quick and just make sure there's no questions I'm missing. Was there anything?
No, I think everybody was intently listening.
Okay, sweet. Yes, and social activism. I know I kind of went fast there. I love this stuff, and I love to keep a good cadence on it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to reshare part of my screen here, and we are on time. We didn't even practice this.
Bam!
We nailed it. Air high five.
Aha!
Okay, so I'm going to share this real quick. This is showing the whole thing. It's probably annoying, so we're not going to do that. We're going to share this.
Half the thing.
Bam, bam. Hold on just a sec, y'all. Okay, so this is where we shift gears into workshop, virtual workshop. Like I said, I've ran these before, so I have a few things. I'm going to orient y'all to it. We're going to figure out how to do it, then we're going to spend time actually engaging the activity. So hang with me, kind of follow my instructions here. First of all, Miro, you should have an email for it in your inbox. The way that it works is a whiteboard, a virtual whiteboard. I have set up what I am calling my measurable action plan. The measurable action plan, or my map, is something that we developed helping gifted and talented students actually years ago. I had a company with a few folks where we worked on self-management skill sets. The curriculum was great. Partners and I didn't keep it going for a number of different reasons outside of that, but we developed this thing called a map, a measurable action plan. And so I'm bringing this up because I developed it. It's not like a patented thing. It's not a empirically validated thing. You're getting into an area where what we're doing is we're going to try to break down, discuss, and figure out what to do in your own life. I'm going to be going along there with you and doing it as well. And we have a whole plan for kind of follow up what to do in the next 2 weeks as well in that Facebook group, or if you're not in that, through email. And so that's kind of my disclaimer of like, I've used this numerous years with some success, but also the big thing here is this is a template that I start with and people adapt off of it. So if you're finding that there's part of this that doesn't work, I'm cool if you can make an argument, just a simple logical one of like, I don't like this because of this reason, so I'm going to do this over here. You can adapt this sort of thing and create different sections. Generally, the way you're going to follow this, you'll see here, we have a, let me zoom in. So we have a step 1, 2, and 3 are at the bottom. It's a little weird there at the bottom. Step 1, you're going to go through and fill in these blue boxes. Who, case demographics, your problem statement, and the free write context. Now, I've set one of these up for everybody, and it has your name in there. If you want to be anonymous, you don't want people to know like what you're breaking down in your own life, you can do a couple things. You can rename these, all right? You can also just not fill out this box here that has date, insert, learner, etc. Now, it's obviously easier if we can track and see who's talking about what and help people out, and I'd love to have that level of detail, but I just want folks to know that if you want this to be anonymous, don't fill that out. You can go up and you can change the name of your personal one. If you can't figure that out, you can just hit me up and I can change it for you to whatever fictitious name you want. I believe Joe Exotic and Carol Baskins are already taken. Total joke. But, okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to go through step 1 for approximately 10 minutes or until you finish, which is just your case demographics. What would be relevant that people should know? I put in here, do you have any kids? Number of hours available in your life to work on things? Whatever. Pick it. Choose it. Develop it. You choose what you want to put here. All of these things are pretty cool. It's dynamic in the sense that you can move around the board. You can also move each of these stickies around. You can also duplicate them if you want to. There's ways to do this. So for example, I can click, I can say edit, I can say, boom, I want to duplicate, I'll be good to go. So you can add these. So this is kind of like setting context of who you are, like we would in a method section. Problem statement, replace this with current issue you're struggling with or want to improve upon. It's just one. I would say let's start with one. If you want to tackle multiple, you can. And then free write context and hypothesize functions. You just do it a little bit of like, this is what I think is going on, what I think the function is, things like that. Things you can potentially test. Number 2 is your nonlinear analysis. And the way that I had set this up is, this is kind of the beauty, I think, of Miro, which is each of these, I started with antecedent. You can adapt this if you want, but I figured we can type in the antecedent here. So I could double click and it could be like, what's the one that you said for your example, Shane?
Like a phone call. We talked about the phone call being an issue.
Cool. So you could have like phone call, right? what's cool here is you can add things before and afterwards. So you can kind of adapt to move these things around. So it's kind of built for thinking about these things in this nonlinear fashion. Now, if you click something, you add something like this, and you're like, oh, I didn't want that. You can click it, click the 3 dots and say delete, boom, it's going to go away. But you can start to break these things down. So just how Shane had in there, he had different contingencies. You could do the first, you can do the second, and you can start to break all of those down, all right? Now, I'm accidentally adding things here because I'm clicking too fast.
Bush League.
Bush League, yes. So note here, the point here is that you can dynamically use this to fit your, get out of here. Oh my gosh, do you need help? No, I don't. Look at that, it noticed my Bush League. So you can break these sort of things down. You can move the whole thing. So if I grab and move, I can move it around if you need more space, etc. My plan here was that we'd spend 30 minutes approximately working on these, like spend some time going in there. I'm gonna get into how we can help you, how we can chat these things out, etc. And then very end is just, do you have a goal statement? Put in whatever statement you'd like to, and then what's your measurement plan? Is there a way that you want to measure it? I'm not particular on what those sort of things are. The goal of this process is that we can come out of this having an idea, some help, sharing amongst each other and breaking down situations that we want to work on, have a place to start, a goal in mind, and a way to start to measure those sort of things. The point of the Facebook group is to share sort of updates as you please. I'll get into that at the end. But this is your context kind of breakdown from Miro. Yo, I hope you find some value in that. For those that attended, we had a blast. We're gonna run this again. Potentially, we're gonna see how this goes though. So it was a 2-hour session twice. This is just the first hour, the information share and getting us ready to roll up our sleeves. Everything went really well, but we're doing a 2-week follow-up to see how things went, and we're keeping in touch throughout. So we're kind of treating this like a, I don't know, like a community group treatment plan in a sense. So anyhow, hope you enjoyed. If there's more on this channel, you can check it out here. Have a fantastic rest of your day. That's your super long 1-hour daily BA.